Lieutenant Nikolai Filtrov stood in the underground command post 50 meters below the surface and could feel every explosion that hit above him. The entire tunnel system shook with each impact as dust fell from the ceiling in constant streams that covered everything in sight. It had been like this for days, or maybe weeks, because down here in this underground world, Filtrov had completely lost track of time. The date was June 15th, 1942, which meant he and his men had been defending Sevastopol for 230 days straight, without relief or reinforcement. Above them, the largest artillery gun ever built was systematically destroying the city block by block, and each shell from this monster weapon weighed 7 tons and created explosions that could be felt kilometers away. Filtrov looked at the 12 soldiers who remained from the company of 120 men he had commanded when the siege began back in October. They were ghosts now, pale from living underground for months, thin from starvation rations that barely kept them alive, and covered in filth that no amount of water could wash away because there was never enough water for anything except drinking. Their uniforms hung in tatters on skeletal frames, and their boots were held together with wire and cloth wrappings, but their rifles still functioned and their hands could still pull triggers, which was all that really mattered anymore in this nightmare. A runner arrived through the tunnels, gasping for breath with the message that German forces were preparing another major assault, which would be the 5th such attack this month alone. Filtrov nodded slowly because he had been expecting this news, and he gathered his 12 remaining men to check weapons and count ammunition before the battle began. Each man had perhaps 30 rounds, plus a handful of grenades, which would have to be enough because there was nothing else available and no resupply was coming. They climbed the narrow stone stairs that led from the underground world toward the surface, toward the hell of fire and steel that waited above, and as they emerged from the tunnel entrance, the world around them exploded into chaos. Artillery shells screamed down from the sky like deadly rain, and the earth heaved and buckled under the impacts as buildings that had stood for a century crumbled into dust within seconds. Smoke and dust choked the air so thick you could not see 10 meters ahead, but Filtrov and his men moved forward anyway through the rubble and fire to reach their defensive positions in the ruins, because Sevastopol would not fall today, not while they still drew breath and could fight. How did this fortress manage to hold out for 250 days against the full concentrated might of the German Wehrmacht? How did Soviet defenders survive what became the most intense artillery bombardment in military history up to that point in the war? And why did Stalin demand they continue fighting to the very last man, even when everyone knew the battle was already lost and the fortress was doomed? This is the story of Sevastopol in 1942, the siege that became a legend, the fortress that absolutely refused to die no matter what the Germans threw at it. Sevastopol was not just any ordinary city, but rather the crown jewel of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, built on the southwestern tip of the Crimean Peninsula, where it had served as a major naval base for over a century since the Crimean War. The city's natural defenses were already formidable, with steep cliffs protecting the harbor and deep valleys making approach difficult, and the Soviets had spent decades adding modern fortifications to these natural advantages. The defensive system included massive concrete bunkers with walls 3 meters thick that could resist all but the heaviest artillery, underground ammunition depots capable of storing thousands of tons of explosives safely, and coastal artillery batteries equipped with guns that could sink battleships at ranges exceeding 20 kilometers. Anti-aircraft positions covered every possible approach route from the air, and beneath everything lay an extensive tunnel system with miles of passages carved through solid rock, some sections going down 70 meters below the surface to create an entire underground world where troops could live and fight. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the Crimean Peninsula immediately became a high-priority strategic target for multiple reasons that Hitler considered vital to the war effort. First, Soviet control of Crimea threatened the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, which meant that Soviet bombers based on the peninsula could strike at the oil that fueled the entire German war machine. Second, the peninsula provided an ideal springboard for future offensive operations into southern Russia toward the Caucasus region and its vast oil reserves. And third, perhaps most importantly, There was Sevastopol itself, with its powerful Black Sea fleet that could dominate naval operations throughout the region and interdict German supply lines. The German 11th Army, under the command of Erich von Manstein, received orders to conquer Crimea and capture Sevastopol as quickly as possible. Manstein was widely regarded as one of the Wehrmacht's most capable and brilliant generals, a master tactician who had proven his abilities during the campaigns in Poland and France with innovative approaches to mobile warfare. Now he faced what would become his greatest challenge, the task of breaking a fortress that had successfully resisted conquest for over a century and had been continuously strengthened by Soviet military engineers. German forces swept through Crimea during September and October of 1941, with their characteristic speed and efficiency, forcing Soviet defenders to retreat steadily back towards Sevastopol as their only remaining stronghold. By late October, the Germans had conquered most of the peninsula, and only Sevastopol remained in Soviet hands, which Manstein's intelligence officers confidently assured him would fall within days once a proper assault was launched. They reported that the Soviet Black Sea Fleet had supposedly evacuated most of its ships, and that the garrison was weak, demoralized, and likely to surrender quickly when faced with determined German attacks. These intelligence assessments proved to be catastrophically wrong in every significant detail. The first German assault came on October 30, 1941, when 4 infantry divisions, supported by Romanian Allied troops, advanced confidently toward the outer defensive ring, expecting only light resistance. Instead, they ran straight into a devastating wall of fire that stopped their advance completely within hours of the attack beginning. Soviet coastal artillery batteries opened up with massive 305mm guns that had been designed to sink battleships but were now turned with terrible effect against German infantry formations. Each shell from these monster guns weighed half a ton, and when they exploded, entire squads of German soldiers simply vanished, while tanks were flipped over like children's toys by the massive concussive force. The German attack collapsed in confusion, and the troops retreated to regroup, leaving behind hundreds of casualties. Manstein was completely stunned by this unexpected outcome because his intelligence had been totally wrong about nearly everything regarding Sevastopol's defenses. The city was not weakly defended, but rather was a fully manned and equipped fortress with thousands of well-trained troops, including Soviet naval infantry, sailors from the Black Sea Fleet who had been converted to infantry roles, and regular army units all determined to fight with everything they had. The Germans had walked directly into a carefully prepared killing ground and paid the price for their overconfidence. Over the following weeks, Manstein carefully probed the defenses, looking for weak points or vulnerable sectors that could be exploited for a breakthrough, but he found absolutely none because every possible approach route was covered by interlocking fields of fire from multiple positions. Soviet bunkers supported each other in a carefully designed defensive system, which meant that if German troops attempted to assault one position, they would immediately come under fire from 3 or 4 other positions simultaneously. The defensive network had been expertly designed by Soviet military engineers who understood modern warfare and had created a nearly perfect defensive system. On November 11th, Manstein launched a second major assault, this time with much heavier preparation, including hours of artillery bombardment and Stuka dive bomber attacks against Soviet bunkers before the infantry advanced. The German troops made some progress this time and managed to capture a few outer fortifications while pushing the defensive perimeter back slightly, but the casualties were absolutely horrific, with hundreds of men lost for every 100 meters of ground gained. The Soviet defenders fought with fierce determination and contested every meter of territory, making the Germans pay in blood for even the smallest advances. What Manstein did not yet fully understand was the true multi-layered nature of Sevastopol's defensive system, which was not just a series of surface positions, but rather a complex network of defensive lines supported by the extensive underground tunnel network. Soviet troops could retreat from surface positions when they became untenable and withdraw into the tunnels where they were completely protected from German fire, then move through the underground passages to emerge somewhere else and launch counterattacks from unexpected directions. The Germans would capture a bunker after hours of fierce fighting, only to be suddenly attacked from behind by Soviet troops who seemed to appear out of nowhere, having moved through tunnels the Germans did not know existed. The tunnel system beneath Sevastopol had been constructed over many decades, with some sections dating back to the original Crimean War fortifications, while other parts represented recent Soviet military engineering. All of these separate tunnel networks had been connected and expanded into a vast underground city with barracks carved from solid rock, ammunition storage depots deep underground, water cisterns to ensure supply, and even complete hospitals where wounded could be treated in relative safety. Some troops lived permanently in these underground facilities for weeks at a time without ever seeing daylight, gradually becoming pale and sickly from the conditions, but continuing to man their positions and fight when called upon. As November turned into December, the weather deteriorated badly with constant rain, sleet, and freezing winds blowing in from the Black Sea, making conditions absolutely miserable for both attackers and defenders. The Germans established siege lines around the city and began bringing up more artillery, more supplies, and more ammunition, while preparing for what they now understood would be a long grinding campaign, rather than the quick victory they had originally expected. Inside Sevastopol, the defenders organized themselves for an extended siege under the command of Vice Admiral Philip Oktyabrski, who divided the entire defensive zone into 4 separate sectors, designated as North, South, East, and Center, with each sector having its own commander, troops, and independent supply system. This organizational structure meant that even if one sector was completely overrun, the other 3 could continue fighting independently, forcing the Germans to reduce each sector individually in a time-consuming process. Food rationing began immediately because feeding the city's swollen population of over 200,000 people, including refugees and military personnel, was impossible with existing supplies. Everything had to be brought in by sea through the German blockade, which meant that Soviet submarines and small fast boats attempted dangerous nighttime runs to deliver supplies while under constant threat from German aircraft and patrol vessels. Many supply ships were sunk and their crews lost, but enough vessels got through to keep the defenders alive and fighting. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was brutally harsh with constant rain that turned defensive trenches into rivers of mud where soldiers lived in water up to their knees. Boots rotted and fell apart, feet developed painful trench foot and frostbite, and disease spread rapidly through the crowded underground shelters where typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia killed hundreds. The hospitals were completely overwhelmed with wounded men lying in corridors and storage rooms wherever space could be found, while medical supplies ran dangerously low. Civilians trapped in the city suffered terribly from starvation as their food rations were cut to barely 200 grams of bread per day, sometimes even less when supply ships failed to get through the blockade. Children and elderly people died from hunger, and their bodies piled up faster than burial parties could handle, especially since German artillery made burial operations extremely dangerous. Sometimes bodies simply lay frozen in the streets waiting for spring. Despite all the suffering and hardship, the defenders continued to hold their positions with remarkable determination, partly because Soviet propaganda had transformed Sevastopol into a powerful symbol of resistance that the entire nation was watching. Radio broadcasts from Moscow praised the heroic defenders, newspapers published inspiring stories of their courage, and Stalin made it absolutely clear that Sevastopol must hold at all costs, because defeat would be unacceptable and surrender was completely unthinkable. Soviet naval infantry, known as Marines, took this message deeply to heart and became especially fanatical in their defense, wearing distinctive black uniforms and black berets that earned them the nickname Black Death among German soldiers who learned to fear them. These Marines were specially trained for amphibious assaults and urban combat, and they defended their positions with absolutely savage determination, fighting literally to the last bullet before using knives and bare hands rather than surrender. One Marine battalion held a fortified position called Fort Stalin for over a month against continuous German attacks that included tanks, flamethrowers, and everything else the Wehrmacht could throw at them. The Germans desperately needed to capture this fort because its guns controlled a critical approach route, so they threw regiment after regiment at the position in repeated assaults. The 300 Marines defending Fort Stalin held out against everything until ammunition ran critically low, at which point they threw rocks at attacking Germans and when enemy infantry finally got close enough, they launched desperate bayonet charges. The fort finally fell in January after the defenders had inflicted over 2,000 German casualties, with only 17 Marines surviving out of the original 300, all of them severely wounded. Stories like this spread through both armies and had profound psychological effects, teaching the Germans that taking Sevastopol would require total commitment and maximum effort with no possibility of easy victory. For the Soviets, these stories proved that resistance was possible and that German forces could be stopped through determination and sacrifice, which helped maintain morale throughout the dark winter months when everything seemed hopeless. German forces continued launching smaller probing attacks through December and January, trying to find weaknesses in the defensive system, but every attack was repulsed with heavy German losses and no significant gains. Manstein realized he needed a completely different approach because he could not simply batter down these powerful defenses with his current resources. So he began planning for a massive, properly coordinated offensive that would require months of preparation. In February 1942, the intensity of fighting decreased, as both sides were utterly exhausted from months of continuous combat. The Germans used this period to consolidate their siege lines, build proper fortifications, and bring up reinforcements, while the Soviets worked frantically to repair damaged defenses and stockpile supplies brought in by the Black Sea Fleet's dangerous nightly supply runs. Stalin sent some of the Soviet Union's most experienced commanders to Sevastopol, including General Ivan Petrov, who took over command of all land forces and immediately reorganized the defensive sectors to improve coordination and make maximum use of the underground tunnel network. Under his expert leadership, the defenders became even more effective at their defensive operations. As spring arrived in 1942, Manstein had accumulated a massive force of 11 divisions, totaling over 200,000 men, hundreds of tanks and assault guns, and more than 1,000 artillery pieces of various types. He also achieved complete air superiority, with the Luftwaffe dominating the skies, though Soviet fighters continued making brave but costly attempts to contest German control. Manstein also had a secret weapon that he believed would be decisive in breaking Sevastopol's strongest fortifications. The weapon was called Schwerer Gustav, or Heavy Gustav, and it was quite simply the largest artillery gun ever built by any nation in human history. This monster weapon had a barrel 32 meters long, and the entire gun weighed an almost incomprehensible 1,350 tons, requiring 2 parallel railway tracks just to support its enormous weight. Operating this behemoth required a crew of 250 men with another 5,000 support personnel needed for assembly, maintenance, and logistics. Gustav fired 800mm shells that were nearly a meter in diameter, with each shell weighing a full 7 tons. The high explosive shells could penetrate 7 meters of reinforced concrete or 38 meters of solid earth, while armor-piercing shells could penetrate even deeper. This gun could theoretically destroy any fortification that existed anywhere on Earth. Transporting Gustav to Crimea required building a special reinforced railway line because normal tracks could not support the weapon's massive weight. The gun was shipped in separate pieces, and assembly took over a month of around-the-clock work by German engineers. But by early June, the weapon was finally ready and positioned 25 kilometers from Sevastopol, where it would be safe from Soviet counter-battery fire. On June 2, 1942, Gustav fired its first shot at Sevastopol, targeting a major Soviet ammunition depot buried deep beneath Fort Molotov Hill. The 7-ton shell arced through the sky, traveling at supersonic velocity, and when it struck, the impact was absolutely catastrophic, penetrating deep underground before detonating and setting off the entire ammunition depot in a massive secondary explosion. Thousands of tons of stored explosives detonated simultaneously, creating a mushroom cloud that was visible across all of Crimea, and the shockwave from the explosion shook buildings 30 kilometers away in Sevastopol, while seismographs in Moscow registered the tremor. Inside the underground tunnel system, Soviet troops felt their world shake violently as lights went out, and tunnel sections collapsed, burying some men alive while others panicked, thinking a nuclear weapon had been used because they had no concept that conventional artillery could create such enormous destruction. Officers worked desperately to restore order and convince their men that this was just a very large shell, and that they could survive if they stayed deep underground. Gustav continued its methodical bombardment over the following days, firing 1 or 2 shells daily, with each shot carefully targeted at a specific fortification that needed to be destroyed. Soviet observers desperately tried to locate the gun so they could attempt to silence it, but Gustav was positioned too far behind German lines and protected by multiple anti-aircraft batteries, making it completely invulnerable to Soviet counterfire. The defenders could do nothing except endure the bombardment and hope their deepest shelters would protect them. Over the next weeks, Gustav systematically destroyed Sevastopol's strongest defensive positions, one after another, with methodical precision. Fort Molotov was completely obliterated. Fort Stalin took a direct hit that penetrated all 3 underground levels, killing everyone inside, and underground bunkers that had withstood months of conventional bombardment crumbled under Gustav's massive shells. The famous coastal battery at Maxim Gorky was disabled when a direct hit blew its massive armored turret completely off its mounting, and 48 shells were fired in total before Gustav's barrel wore out from the extreme stresses and had to be replaced. While Gustav was pounding the key defensive positions, Manstein's conventional artillery prepared for the main offensive by stockpiling hundreds of thousands of shells and positioning over 1,000 guns around Sevastopol in carefully planned positions. This would be the largest artillery bombardment ever conducted on the Eastern Front up to that point in the war, exceeding even the massive barrages at Moscow and Leningrad. The offensive was given the codename Operation Sturgeon Catch, and the plan was straightforward but brutal. Overwhelming firepower, followed by mass infantry assault using concentrated force against the northern sector to achieve a breakthrough, then rolling up the entire defensive system from the flank. If everything went according to Manstein's plan, Sevastopol would fall within 2 weeks. On June 7, 1942, Operation Sturgeon Catch began at precisely 5 in the morning, when every German gun opened fire simultaneously in a bombardment that can only be described as apocalyptic. Shells fell like deadly rain, and the entire city disappeared beneath smoke and dust as the noise became a continuous thunder that went on for hours without pause. Soviet positions were systematically pulverized, with trenches collapsing, bunkers being buried, and communication lines cut, leaving the defenders able to do nothing except hide in their deepest shelters and pray for survival. After 5 hours of continuous bombardment, the artillery shifted to create a creeping barrage that moved forward at walking pace, and behind this protective wall of exploding shells, German infantry advanced, supported by tanks, combat engineers with flamethrowers, and assault guns. They hit the Soviet northern sector with 8 full divisions comprising over 80,000 men in just the first assault wave. The Soviet defenders had been expecting this attack and were as prepared as circumstances allowed, and as German troops entered the shattered defensive zone, Soviet survivors emerged from underground shelters to set up machine guns in the rubble and open devastating fire. The Germans had overwhelming numerical superiority, but the Soviets occupied superior defensive positions where every pile of rubble concealed a firing position and every crater held armed troops waiting in ambush. The fighting became savage close-range combat, with battles for individual buildings, rooms, and bunkers that had to be cleared one at a time using grenades and flamethrowers. Soviet Marines fought with fanatical determination, refusing to surrender or retreat, and when their ammunition finally ran out, they used knives and bare hands before falling back into the tunnel system to emerge elsewhere and launch counterattacks from unexpected directions. Progress was measured in meters, with German forces advancing maybe a few hundred meters each day, at costs that horrified even veteran troops. Companies that went into battle with 150 men would come out with only 50 survivors, and the next day those same 50 exhausted men would be sent back into the inferno. Casualties mounted into the thousands, but Manstein kept pushing forward because he had fully committed to this offensive, and there was absolutely no possibility of turning back now. Lieutenant Filtrov and his dwindling company held a defensive position they called the schoolhouse, which had been an actual school building before the war, but was now just a pile of rubble with an intact basement that connected to the tunnel system. For 10 days, Filtrov's men defended this position against continuous German attacks that included artillery bombardment, direct tank fire at close range, and assault troops with flamethrowers. But nothing worked because every time Germans entered the building, Soviet troops appeared from the basement to throw grenades and open fire before disappearing underground again before German artillery could respond. By late June, Manstein had pushed the Soviet defenders back to the inner defensive ring around the city itself. But progress had slowed to an agonizing crawl, and his divisions were utterly exhausted, with casualties exceeding 30,000 men, or over one-third of his entire assault force. Some units were so depleted they were no longer combat effective and needed to be withdrawn. But Hitler was growing increasingly impatient because he needed the 11th Army for Operation Blue, the summer offensive toward the Caucasus that was about to begin. Hitler gave Manstein an ultimatum to take Sevastopol by the end of June, or the entire operation would be cancelled and the army redeployed eastward, which meant Manstein had no choice except to throw everything into one final desperate assault, using his last reserves and remaining ammunition stockpiles. German forces attacked on all sectors simultaneously with overwhelming pressure from every direction, and the Soviets fought back with desperate fury, knowing this was probably the end. Street fighting in the ruined city became absolutely apocalyptic as buildings were blown apart. Roads disappeared under mountains of rubble, and the air became poisoned from smoke, dust, and gas from destroyed chemical plants. Soldiers wore makeshift cloth masks just to breathe, and visibility was often reduced to just a few meters, causing units to lose contact with each other and fight isolated battles without knowing if anyone else was even still alive. Soviet command and control began breaking down completely as radio communications were lost, telephone lines were destroyed, and runners could not get through the combat zones with orders. Local commanders made their own decisions, with some organizing desperate counterattacks, while others retreated or simply fought where they stood until killed. But all continued fighting because Stalin's orders remained unchanged despite the hopelessness of the situation. By July, first German forces had penetrated deep into the city and reached the harbor area, cutting off various Soviet units from each other and fragmenting the defense into isolated pockets. Moscow finally gave permission for evacuation on July 3rd, but by then it was too late because Germans controlled the harbor and all roads out were cut, making escape impossible for most of the remaining defenders. A few thousand Soviet soldiers managed to reach the Crimean Peninsula west of Sevastopol, where they held out for several more days, hoping for rescue by sea, and Soviet submarines and small boats made brave attempts to evacuate them under heavy German fire. About 2,000 men were successfully rescued, but the rest were killed or captured when German forces overran the peninsula on July 9th. Lieutenant Filtrov and his men fought in the tunnels until July 8th, when they finally ran out of ammunition, food, and water after 2 days without drinking. They were surrounded deep underground with Germans controlling the surface and pumping poison gas into the tunnel network to force out the last defenders. Filtrov gathered his 7 surviving men and made the decision to surrender rather than die from the gas, and they emerged from a tunnel entrance with hands raised, barely able to walk after months of underground existence. The Germans stared at them in shock because these were not soldiers, but rather walking skeletons in tattered uniforms with sunken eyes and skin stretched tight over bones. The Germans captured approximately 90,000 Soviet troops in total, along with thousands of wounded who could not be evacuated, while another 30,000 defenders had been killed during the siege. The fortress had finally fallen after 250 days of continuous fighting. Sevastopol itself was completely destroyed, with not a single building remaining intact, and the harbor filled with sunken ships, while millions of unexploded shells and bombs littered the ruins, requiring years to clear. For the Germans, it was a Pyrrhic victory because they had captured the fortress, but at catastrophic cost, with over 25,000 killed and 75,000 wounded, leaving the 11th Army too shattered to participate immediately in Operation Blue. For the Soviets, Sevastopol became a legend of resistance and determination, with Stalin awarding it the title Hero City after the war as one of only 12 Soviet cities to receive this highest honor. The defenders who survived became heroes, and their story was told repeatedly in books, films, and monuments erected across the Soviet Union. Lieutenant Filtrov survived German captivity barely, spending 3 years in prisoner of war camps, enduring starvation, disease, and forced labor before liberation in 1945. After liberation, he spent 6 months in Soviet filtration camps, proving his loyalty before finally being allowed to return home. And he never spoke much about Sevastopol because the memories were too painful. He died in 1987 at age 68 and was buried in his old Soviet Marine uniform, which still had the medal for the defense of Sevastopol that he had kept through everything. The ruins of Sevastopol still hold secrets in unexplored tunnels, sealed bunkers, and mass graves that construction crews occasionally discover when digging foundations, sometimes finding skeletons in Soviet uniforms with rusted weapons and messages scrawled on walls by men who knew they would never leave. The fortress may have fallen, but the underground city remains as a monument carved in stone to the men who would not surrender until they had absolutely no choice remaining. The daily reality of life in the underground tunnels during the siege was far worse than most histories convey, with conditions that gradually destroyed both physical health and mental stability over the long months. The air in the deeper sections was perpetually damp and thick with mold spores that caused constant respiratory problems, while the smell of unwashed bodies became so overpowering that men stopped noticing it after a while. Ventilation was minimal in many tunnel sections, which meant carbon dioxide would build up to dangerous levels, causing men to sometimes fall asleep and never wake up because they suffocated in their sleep from bad air. Water dripped constantly from the stone ceilings, making everything perpetually wet so that uniforms never dried and boots rotted directly on men's feet, leading to widespread fungal infections and skin conditions that affected virtually every defender. Lice infested absolutely everyone, from the highest-ranking generals down to the lowest privates, breeding rapidly in the warm, humid conditions and spreading typhus that became epidemic in some tunnel sections. Infected men would develop high fevers and delirium, with many dying because medical staff had no antibiotics or proper disinfectants, just limited supplies of bandages and morphine that were rapidly running out. The medical situation became so desperate that doctors were sometimes forced to perform amputations without anesthesia using whatever tools were available, and the screams of these patients could be heard echoing through the tunnel system. Food became the constant, all-consuming obsession for everyone in the fortress, because the official ration was supposed to be 800 grams of bread daily for combat troops, but actual distribution was far less. When supply ships failed to get through the blockade, men became skeletal with uniforms hanging loose on wasting frames and belts tightened to the last hole, then beyond using string or wire to keep pants from falling down. Hunger created a physical pain that was constant and gnawing, dominating every thought and making men dream endlessly about meals they had eaten before the war, with elaborate detailed descriptions that became a form of psychological torture. Some units organized desperate hunting parties that would venture into no man's land at night, trying to scavenge anything remotely edible. But after months of siege, there was simply nothing left to find, because every bird had been shot, every rat had been trapped, and every scrap of vegetation had been consumed. Soldiers would search through rubble looking for food stores in collapsed buildings, and when they occasionally found a single can of meat, it became a precious treasure that would be divided with mathematical precision to ensure every man received exactly equal portions. The worst period of starvation came in March and April of 1942, when winter had disrupted supply runs and rations were cut to maybe 200 grams of bread every other day, with absolutely nothing else, forcing men to boil leather from belts and boots to make a kind of soup that had no nutritional value but temporarily filled stomachs. There are documented cases of cannibalism among the defenders, though Soviet authorities denied this for decades, with bodies of men who died in the tunnels sometimes disappearing before they could reach official collection points for burial. Soldiers caught cutting flesh from corpses were immediately shot as an example to others, but the practice continued in the deepest, most isolated tunnel sections where supervision was minimal and starvation had driven men beyond normal human limits. The psychological strain of knowing you were trapped with no relief coming and probable death waiting created mental breakdown in many soldiers, with some men simply sitting in tunnel corners, rocking back and forth while they stopped eating and speaking, just waiting passively for death to come. Suicide became surprisingly common, though it was rarely discussed openly, with men volunteering for obviously suicidal missions and attacks that had absolutely no chance of success, because they wanted their deaths to at least count for something, rather than slowly starving in the darkness. Officers faced perhaps the hardest burden of all, because they had to maintain morale while knowing the situation was completely hopeless. Had to order men to die for positions that did not matter strategically just because Moscow said hold, and different officers developed different approaches, with some becoming ruthlessly brutal and shooting deserters without trial, while others tried leading by example and sharing every danger with their men. German soldiers besieging the city had their own terrible suffering, despite not facing starvation like the Soviets, because every assault cost hundreds or thousands of casualties, and the replacements arriving were increasingly just boys of 17 or 18 with minimal training who died quickly before learning the hard lessons that might have saved them. German veterans developed a grudging respect mixed with hatred for the Soviet defenders, especially the naval infantry marines in their distinctive black uniforms, who absolutely never surrendered or retreated and would continue fighting with multiple terrible wounds, using their last grenades on themselves rather than accept capture. Some German units actually refused to assault certain heavily defended positions after taking catastrophic casualties for negligible gains, and their officers generally understood because these were not cowards, but rather men pushed beyond any reasonable human limits. Romanian forces fighting alongside the Germans suffered even worse casualties because they had inferior equipment, less training, and lower morale, which meant that when assigned to assault Soviet positions, Romanian units would sometimes simply refuse outright or attack so half-heartedly that they took casualties without achieving any objectives. The Luftwaffe provided crucial air support throughout the siege, with German aircraft controlling the skies and bombing Soviet positions daily while attacking supply ships. But air superiority alone could not win the battle, because ultimately infantry had to go into the ruins and clear bunkers and fight in tunnels where technological advantages disappeared completely. Soviet aircraft tried desperately to contest German air superiority, with small numbers of fighters and bombers flying extremely long missions from airfields in the Caucasus, hundreds of kilometers away. But they had minimal fuel for actual combat and could only attack quickly before leaving, with many planes never returning after being shot down by German fighters or anti-aircraft fire. The pilots displayed almost suicidal bravery, taking terrible risks for minimal results. But they kept flying because Sevastopol needed them, and the defenders on the ground needed to know someone was still trying to help them. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet performed genuine heroics throughout the siege, with destroyers and cruisers making daring nighttime dashes to shell German positions, land supplies, and evacuate wounded before racing away at maximum speed before dawn, when German aircraft could catch them in daylight. Several ships were sunk during these operations, either torpedoed by German submarines or bombed by Stukas. But the dangerous missions continued because without these supply runs, Sevastopol would have fallen months earlier. Submarines were particularly important because they could approach underwater and surface inside the harbor under cover of darkness to unload supplies and evacuate personnel before submerging again to slip away. And Soviet submarines made dozens of these incredibly dangerous runs, with some boats completing 5 or 6 missions while others were lost on their very first attempt. As the final German assault developed in June 1942, the defenders made one last desperate effort to disrupt German preparations by launching counterattacks wherever possible, with Soviet Marines emerging from hidden tunnels behind German lines to attack supply dumps and ambush convoys before disappearing back underground. One particularly successful raid occurred on June 10th, when a full company of Marines infiltrated 3 kilometers behind German lines through a tunnel system and attacked a major fuel depot at dawn, setting fire to thousands of liters of gasoline in an explosion visible across Crimea that forced German aircraft to be grounded for hours because smoke obscured their airfields. The Marines escaped with only light casualties in what was a tactical masterpiece, though strategically it was meaningless because the Germans had abundant fuel reserves and the attack only delayed them perhaps one day. Individual acts of extraordinary heroism became almost commonplace during the siege, with one Soviet sniper reportedly killing over 200 German soldiers, a machine gun crew holding a single position for 18 straight days against continuous attacks while firing over 100,000 rounds before all 3 crew members were found dead, surrounded by empty shell casings, when the position was finally overrun. Another soldier destroyed 7 German tanks in a single day, using nothing but anti-tank rifles before being killed by the 8th tank. But he had bought precious time for his unit to retreat to better positions. These stories were systematically collected by Soviet political officers and turned into powerful propaganda that was broadcast on radio and published in newspapers across the Soviet Union, with the goal of inspiring other defenders and showing that resistance was possible, that heroism was expected, and that sacrifice had deep meaning. German propaganda worked differently by broadcasting directly into Sevastopol, promising excellent treatment for those who surrendered, showing photographs of supposedly well-fed Soviet prisoners and claiming that the war was already lost and continued resistance was completely futile. Some Soviet soldiers believed these promises and did surrender, but most did not because they had heard terrible stories about how Germans actually treated prisoners with starvation, death marches, and summary executions, so they preferred to die fighting with at least some dignity and purpose. The final days of Sevastopol in early July 1942 were absolutely apocalyptic, with the city reduced to nothing but ruins and craters, the harbour clogged with sunken ships, streets completely impassable, and thousands of bodies lying unburied and rotting in the summer heat, creating an unbearable smell and spreading disease. Cholera broke out in some areas, killing men as quickly as combat, and Soviet command tried desperately to organize a final evacuation, using submarines and small boats, making extremely dangerous runs into the harbor to take off whoever they could, with priority given to wounded, specialists, and political officers, while regular soldiers were told to fight to the death. A few tried to force their way onto evacuation vessels and were shot by guards, while most boats that left successfully made it to safety, though some were sunk by German patrol vessels with everyone aboard lost. The last organized Soviet resistance collapsed on July 8, with units fragmenting into small isolated groups, some continuing to fight from individual positions, while others hid in the deepest tunnels, hoping somehow to survive until relief that would never come. Lieutenant Filtrov's final battle came on July 7th, when he and his few remaining men had retreated to a tunnel complex beneath a destroyed factory, with Germans controlling the surface and systematically clearing underground areas, using explosives to collapse tunnels and poison gas to force defenders out. Filtrov knew escape was impossible, so he positioned his 7 men with their last 43 rounds of ammunition and 6 grenades, and when Germans found the tunnel entrance and called for surrender, he chose not to respond, forcing them to attack. The Germans threw grenades into the tunnel, and the confined space made the explosions devastating, killing 3 of Filtrov's men instantly, while wounding 2 others and hitting Filtrov himself with shrapnel, though he remained conscious. When German soldiers entered the narrow tunnel, Filtrov and his 2 unwounded survivors opened fire, and the passage became a perfect killing zone, where the first 3 Germans fell immediately, causing others to pull back and throw more grenades that finished the wounded Soviet soldiers. Now only Filtrov and one 19-year-old boy remained with maybe 10 rounds between them, and they heard Germans preparing another assault, but then heard voices speaking in Russian telling them to surrender with promises of good treatment. Filtrov considered fighting to the death, but he was exhausted beyond measure, and there was perhaps a tiny chance of surviving to see home again. So he made the decision to surrender, and they put down their weapons, raised their hands, and emerged from the tunnel into German custody. The Germans actually treated them decently with water, bread, and medical attention for wounds, before marching them to a prisoner collection point where thousands of others waited, and the march took hours through the complete ruins of Sevastopol, which no longer existed as a city, but was just endless rubble and craters representing all that sacrifice and suffering for absolutely nothing except rubble. But Filtrov did not regret his actions, because he had done his duty and held as long as any human could possibly hold, making the Germans pay in blood for every meter of ground, and that was all any soldier could do in such circumstances. The fortress had fallen, but it had never surrendered, which was an important distinction that would be remembered long after the ruins were cleared and new buildings rose and everyone who fought there was dead, because Sevastopol would always be remembered as the fortress that absolutely would not fall until it had no choice left and was physically destroyed.